from the time you were very little. You've had people who have smiled you into smiling, people who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving.
When I was thinking about what I wanted to say while preparing to preach a sermon on Love Your Neighbour, I wanted to find out more about Fred Rogers, who I'd learned about in the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighbourhood. That film was based on an article written in 1998 by Tom Junot, an investigative reporter who was at first a bit put out to be asked to write about a hokey kids show presenter, but who was changed for the better by the experience. It wasn't intended to be so, but the article ended up being used as a cover for Esquire magazine in November of 1998, and I'll put a link to the article up. And I learned that there were 4 things in the movie about Fred Rogers that he would do each day. He would get up and read the Bible. He would swim some laps. He would pray for people by name, quite a long list, I think, after time. And he would write personal letters. And I found that quite touching. As well as the movie on Netflix, I found a documentary about him called Won't You Be My Neighbour, which had a clip of him, which I used in the sermon, saying, from the time you were very little, you've had people who've smiled you into smiling, people who've talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. What I didn't show in the sermon was that he then went on to encourage the audience, he was at a graduation ceremony, to reflect on those people, saying, on this extra special day, let's take some time to think about those extra special people. Some of them might be right here, some might be far away, some may even be in heaven, but no matter where they are, deep down you know that they've wanted the best for you. They've cared about you beyond measure and have encouraged you to be true to the best within you. And then he would get them to take a time in silence to think about that. I gather that whenever he was asked to speak in public, he often would do that, even when he was giving an acceptance speech for an Emmy Award in 1997. Sometimes he would give a minute. I think then he just gave 10 seconds. But he knew that being loved and loving your neighbour was such a rich and important thing. You know, Fred Rogers is a great example of not having some sacred and secular divide in his life, not having a Christian or spiritual set of things that he did and said sometimes, and then perhaps trying to bring those spiritual things into the other parts of his life. He simply lived in God and God in him. And so everything he did and everyone he met were awash with the character and presence of Jesus. In the documentary, someone says of him that he had a whole spiritual dimension, and that his life and his work doing the Mr. Rogers Neighbourhood show for, over 30 years, it spanned 4 decades, that doing that and everything else in his life was shaped by the overarching theology of love your neighbour as yourself. He was able, I believe, to maintain his focus and his genuineness over such a long public ministry time, even though you might not think of it as ministry running a kids' TV show. But he wasn't, a different Fred Rogers on TV as he was at home. He was just a man of integrity. And I think that integrity, that genuineness, that authenticity, and as I said, his focus, I believe he could maintain that because he never played to an audience. He pictured himself always as if speaking to just one child. And he describes the privilege of being able to do that as being on holy ground. He knew the image of God in others, and so knew that loving others was also loving God. I'd encourage you, find the time to watch the movie and the documentary, to read the article, and perhaps as well to take some time now to think about someone who has smiled you into smiling, talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. And then I'll finish by reading a little bit from the end of the article I mentioned at first. The journalist writing the article begins talking about having lost a stuffed toy as a child, partly because puppets and stuffed toys were a big part of the way Fred Rogers in his TV show would present things and reach to children. And he talks about this experience at the end of the article. He says, I went to his office in Pittsburgh. Fred Rogers was sitting on a couch under a framed rendering of the Greek word for grace and a biblical phrase written in Hebrew that means, I'm my beloved and my beloved is mine. A woman was with him sitting in a big chair. Her name was Deb. She was a minister at Fred Rogers' church, and she spent much of her time tending to the sick and dying, and Fred loved her very much. So one day out of nowhere he smiled and put his hand over hers and said, will you be with me when I die? He asked her. And when she said yes, he said, oh, thank you, my dear. Then, with his hand still over hers and his eyes looking straight into hers, he said, Deb, do you know what a great prayer you are? Do you know that about yourself? Your prayers are just wonderful. Then he looked over at me. I was sitting in a small chair by the door, and he said, Tom, would you close the door, please? I closed the door and sat back down. Thanks, he said. Then he turned back to Deb. Now, Deb, I'd like to ask you a favour. Would you lead us? Would you lead us in prayer? He moved his hand from her wrist to her palm and extended his other hand to me. I took it and then put my hand around her free hand. His hand was warm, hers was cool, and we bowed our heads and closed our eyes. I heard her voice calling out for the grace of God. What is grace? I'm not certain. All I know is that before my heart felt like a spike, and then in that room it opened and felt like an umbrella. I'd never prayed like that before, ever. I'd always been a prayer, but only fitfully, only out of guilt, only when fear and desperation drove me to it. And it hit me right then, with my eyes closed, that this was the moment Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, had been leading me to from the moment he answered the door of his apartment in his bathroom and asked me about my old rabbit. Once upon a time, you see, I'd lost something and prayed to get it back. But when I lost it the second time, I didn't pray. And now this was it. The missing word, the unuttered promise, the prayer I've been waiting to say a very long time. Thank you, God, Mr. Rogers said.